different people ask questions about that. This is Kaylee Cordray, an online student. She said, a lot of your sponsored bills, ma'am, are in relation to the LGBTQ plus community. What are some other ways? And then she names a couple bills that you've worked at, that you are willing to fight for the rights of this community. And I do have a follow-up, but first I'd like you to speak broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, here in Missouri, the last 2 years, one of the fights that I hate having the least are fights that have to do with someone's personal identity. Whether or not you personally choose to love somebody of the same sex, of a different sex, of whatever, that really shouldn't be any concern of the state government, in my opinion. Like, what you want to do in your bedroom should be as far away from the state legislature as anything in the world. In the last few years, we've had a lot of conversations about whether or not we should ban certain children because of their sexual identity from participating in sports, or ban certain children from having access to medical care based on the fact that they may or may not identify as their sex at birth. So for me, I spend a lot of time in Jefferson City trying to fight the fight for the people who don't have a strong voice in the Capitol. There's not a huge lobbying corps, there's not billions of dollars that are getting pumped into the state legislature on behalf of trans children, right? That's just kind of a group that has been marginalized and is going to continue to be marginalized. And again, whatever your feelings on that issue are, I don't think that it's the state's responsibility to come into a school, come into a home, come into any entity and decide what's best for that children, or for that child. I think that's up to the local school board. I think that's up to the family. So when you look at some of the fights that we've had on the House floor, a lot of them are surrounding vulnerable groups of people. And as a minority party, that's our job and our privilege to make sure that those individuals have voices. Another thing that I would really like to see done at the state level is the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. That would make it to where people in the state of Missouri could not be discriminated against legally based on who they love. And again, I think we are one of a very few handful of states who don't have that policy enacted, and we are losing out, not to make this an economic argument because it's a human rights argument, but on top of that, we are losing out on big businesses wanting to relocate to the state of Missouri because they have a gay CEO, or they have a CEO who has a lesbian daughter. They don't want to come to a state where they're worried their family are going to be targeted. And when I'm out knocking doors, I hear that all the time. Like, my 18-year-old child left the state of Missouri to move to a different one because they did not feel safe and welcomed here. So again, it's my privilege and my absolute responsibility to make sure that those groups of people have a voice in the Capitol.
We always get questions every semester about minimum wage. Representative, let's ask this one from Ellie Van Dyke. She's an online student. She says, I see, this is her voice, I see that you believe in raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In doing so, do you think, let me read her question. In doing so, when do you think this will be established in Missouri? Although it is a big jump from the $11.15 we're at now, why can we not eagerly change this?
So I don't know where I publicly said that. I wish I could remember so I could cite it better. But right now in Missouri, conversations that we were having 5 years ago about minimum wage are kind of null and void, in my opinion, because already employers are having to pay substantially more because of the things that we talked about earlier. So though 3 or 4 years ago, $15 an hour seemed like a significant livable wage, now the same individuals who are working $15 an hour are still struggling to make ends meet. So for me, I don't know if I have a magic number or a magic timeline because of course it's so dependent on the economy. But going back to workers and workers' rights, I think that everyone should be able to have the dignity of working a full-time job and making a living that allows them to care for their family. I think that is the absolute bare minimum that employers and employees should expect from one another. I think we have a lot of really wonderful employers in the state that are already doing that are trying to be competitive. That's what we're seeing across the board right now. Places that historically have always been able to find employees, that have always been able to find employees are now struggling. So not only are they having to pay more in salary, they're having to be creative about how do I recruit people. Driving here, I saw probably 15 signs that said hiring $17 an hour. Something that I worked on a lot that I'll bring the conversation back to was pay raises for our state employees. So the way our budgetary cycle works is we set the state's budget the year before, and then it comes into effect for the next fiscal year. And as a state employer, as a member of the legislature, I view myself as an employer of the state because I help oversee the business of the state. we were paying a lot of our frontline workers that worked in children's division, in our mental health hospitals, we were paying them $11, $12 an hour. So yeah, I fought tooth and nail to increase those pay raises for workers of the state, because that's some of the most vital work that goes on, and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vacancies within these very important vulnerable offices. And it was because our state budget was set in a way that we couldn't pay them more than $11 or $12 an hour, when Taco Bell or Amazon or some of those other entities were paying upwards of $15, $20 an hour. By no means am I saying that people who work at Taco Bell shouldn't make $20 an hour, but I'm saying as an employer of the state, I felt it was definitely my obligation to fight for a pay raise for our frontline workers.
Any questions or thoughts or comments for Representative Fogle while we have her?
Oh, yeah. So, circling back to our conversation about polarization happening in America, I'm from Nixa. In like 2021, in April, we had an election for city council, and there was, I want to say like 3 or 4 Republican representatives that were running, and there was one Democrat that was running, and she ended up winning by a small margin. But she had like so many smear campaigns against her. So I'm just wondering, have you experienced the polarization firsthand? Have you ever had people come against you specifically for your party affiliation in Springfield?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, again, it's kind of, it really is a privilege to represent a constituency where half of the people in my district disagree with me on a lot. There are probably 4 or 5 districts in the state that are as competitive as mine. Most are very decided already. So a lot of rural districts across the state, of course, are 80% Republican, 20% Democrat. And then when you look at my colleagues from the city of Kansas City and the city of St. Louis, they're 90% Democrat, 10% Republican. So I get to live in a district that has equal representation of both political parties, which means when I am out knocking doors, a lot of times people will accuse me or say things to me that are just absolutely untrue, right? If I had $1 for every time I was told things like, you're trying to kill all the children because you believe in vaccines, or you're a terrible person, you stole the election, like those narratives that we hear at the federal level and state level that trickle down to our constituency are really heartbreaking. What is equally as heartbreaking, or more heartbreaking in my opinion, is a lot of times people on the House floor will say things and then they'll come up to me after and they will say, I don't actually believe that, but I have to appeal to my base. Or I don't actually believe that, but I have to appeal to this lobbying group or whatever. And I'm sure both sides of the aisle do it. But one thing that I can tell you is I have never had to apologize for a vote, and I will never say anything on the House floor that I don't mean. And I hate when we play into this narrative that we have to be these two absolutely polarizing political parties. I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of what we do is bipartisan in nature. 95% of the bills that we vote on have support from both aisles and both chambers. But oftentimes media doesn't pick those up because it's not as exciting to read about people getting along, right? It's more exciting to see people fighting or yelling at each other. And so, for me, it's how do I recognize that it's happening? I've knocked doors where I've had guns pulled on me. Like, that's not fun. But I also know that I have to be a part of the solution. So when I talk about individuals on the other side of the aisle or my party members, I always make sure what I'm saying is accurate, is backed by science and data, that I can prove what I'm saying. And I never talk about somebody personally. I never bring up anything that doesn't have to do with somebody's voting record, because at the end of the day, as elected officials, we are sent up there to vote and to do work on behalf of the people, and the rest doesn't matter. So it is oftentimes worse than you see in Jefferson City, but oftentimes it's way better than you see as well. And there's a lot of really good relationships. I think Alex Riley was here yesterday. He's one of my best friends in and outside of the building. And I think you just find the people who you can build those relationships with, and we know when we're going to disagree, and we know when we're going to agree, and we try to find things in common that we can help move the state forward. And then when I think he's wrong, I tell him, and when he thinks I'm wrong, he tells me. But we don't do it in a way that's, tearing down of one another.
We only have Representative Fogle for a few more minutes, so take advantage of it if you have a thought or a comment. And we have a great question from Alana Livingston. Actually, in the Missouri General Assembly, there are term limits. What are your thoughts on term limits for members of, she says Congress, so U.S. Congress we'll say.
So is the question about U.S. Congress or?
Let's do both.
Okay.
U.S. Congress and the General Assembly of Missouri.
I will talk more specifically about the General Assembly because I've lived that experience, of course. You know, for those of you who don't know, in the Missouri State House, you can serve 4 2-year terms. So I can serve up to 8 years in the Missouri House. If I chose, I could go run for Senate and serve 4 2-year terms. So you have 2 4-year terms, 4 2-year terms. You can serve a total of 8 in both chambers for a complete 16 if you want. That changed. In the past, you could serve a lot longer. And I think, though well-intended, and term limits are something that a lot of Missourians and a lot of Americans are in favor of, I would have been in that camp probably up until being a part of the General Assembly and learning firsthand how long it takes to understand things like the budget. I said this earlier, I serve on the State Appropriations Committee. When you stack the budget up on top of itself, it is my height times 2. And I read every word of that multiple times every year so I understand what's going on. But every few years you have people that cycle out and then a new crop of people that are coming in that have to also learn 2 stacks of my height of pieces of paper. And I think something I would like to see our state move toward is something like maybe you could serve a total of 16 years, but in either chamber. So if I wanted, I could serve 16 years and get really good at it in the House, or 16 years in the Senate. You know, I'm on the ballot every 2 years. If the people of the 135th don't want me there anymore, and there's a chance on November 8th they don't, that's my term limit. You know, my accountability to my people is kind of my term limit. So for me, I think I've seen the good and the bad. Another thing that I don't like about our term limits is it gives incredible power to lobbyists because they're the people who have the institutional knowledge. They're the people who can say, well, we did that a few years ago, or I understand that issue, or you know, I'm paid to understand that issue. And if you're only serving in the General Assembly for a few years, then you don't have the opportunity to learn everything about economic policy, environmental policy, transportation policy, like all the things that we're expected to know. In terms of congressional term limits, since I have not served there, I wouldn't want to speak too knowledgeably on that, other than I think I hear from constituents a lot that probably some of those individuals have served a little too long. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, one last chance. Any questions?
Yeah.
Why do you maintain your position as a capitalist when a key component of capitalism is the exploitation of the working class?
And that is a really, really good question. I will let you know, ma'am, you got about a minute.
Okay.
So that is a tough question to answer in 60 seconds. But
It
give your
is.
best.
So I think, you know, every term that I throw out can be referenced and used in a lot of different ways. You know, I'll counter and say a question I get a lot is people accusing me of being a socialist, right? But capitalism inherently has a lot of components of socialism built in. It just benefits those who already have money. So when I say I'm a capitalist, I really just mean generally, I believe in an economic workforce that everyone can participate in, that workers can have dignity in their jobs. There is, of course, a lot surrounding the word capitalism that I don't necessarily believe in or support, but in a general sense, I think that capitalism is an economic system that, if done correctly, can benefit workers, and that's what I believe in.
So I just want to be clear for something that I said earlier when I said you were incredibly responsive. This is a very common thing I hear from everybody, not just instructors and such. So if somebody from this class or listening to this video is interested in contacting you, it's the best way to do it, ma'am.
Absolutely, and I'm looking at you because I feel like we're going to have a follow-up conversation, and I'd love to hear from you. Write down my cell phone number. It is 417, for anyone interested, 417-576-6440. If you're uncomfortable doing that, you can also email me. My email is Betsy, B-E-T-S-Y, at Fogle, F-O-G-L-E, number 4, M-O.com. So Betsy at FogleForMo.com. Also, if you Google me, you will eventually find a website that links to my email. You're always welcome to reach out if you have questions about policy. If you live in the 135th, so if you're on the other side of National, I'm your state rep. If you have bills you want to see filed, if you want any information about why I voted the way I voted, feel free to reach out.
Okay, round of applause. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah.
All right.